We don't really like the idea of having to pay people to do things that we think they should be doing anyway, and we think are valuable for society's good. We would hope that people turn out because they feel that they can influence public policy. The problem is, to the extent that they don't think that they're influencing public policies, then you have to come up with some way of giving people what I would call an incentive to think that their vote is worth something.
The problem is if you have the pure open market, then someone can buy 1 million votes for maybe $2 million. But after all, the objection to the typical electoral process is that it doesn't measure the intensity of the individual's preference.
But that would also be an advantage, wouldn't it, of a straightforward market in votes?
No, because with every vote priced the same, the disproportionate influence of one wealthy person would be seriously undemocratic.
But there are some people who spend millions on elections even now.
You're talking about people who contribute to candidates. They don't obtain the votes directly.
Right.
They have hopes for how
Right.
people will vote influenced by this contribution.
If there were a free market in votes, what do you think would be the equilibrium price? It'd be less than $1 million,
Well, I'll
wouldn't it?
tell you that in California, people were willing to give up their votes for $19. 50% of American adults could not go and find $400. So if you think about $20 to sell your vote of a $400, it then starts to put the numbers into better context.
Is it a civic duty to vote that would be somehow corrupted if people sold their votes to other people?
I don't think the concept of civic duty, I don't think that resonates with American values.
Really?
Really. This is a very individualistic society. People want to do what they want to do. They don't want to be told what to do. Now, a lot of people would say, I don't want to vote for any of these people. Leave me alone. I don't have a duty to vote for someone who I don't think is any good.
Is there any good reason why people shouldn't be free to buy and sell votes?
Yeah, as we described in earlier markets, if you think about your voting eligibility as a property right, you could be willing to sell or not sell it. So what is the consequence on the rest of the population if the vote is shifted around in that way in accordance with this vote buying? Of course, it's a natural area to think about externalities because there is a public good at stake here in terms of an election or some other policy choice. So I think it's possible one could come up with an argument that would say that this vote buying wasn't such a good idea.
You don't want the government to provide the money.
Correct. I don't think it's the role of the government to get involved.
But
I think
any
it should be
third party? Well, suppose the third party is a casino.
Because they're so directly involved, it creates a corruption process.
Suppose it's some other company that doesn't have a ballot measure.
Then I think that's okay.
What would such a company be that might sponsor, I don't know, McDonald's offers a free Big Mac to anyone who votes?
I think that would be okay if they're not directly involved because it's creating a better functioning democracy, getting more people to vote, and helping to offset the opportunity cost of voting, and without providing a very direct correlation to a particular side of
Lindsay, do you really think a Big Mac would offset your opportunity costs of voting?
No, but it would provide some benefit, which I appreciate.
Okay, Abdul.
Well, regardless if it's a Big Mac, I think paying people to vote corrupts the motivation to vote. People will start to go to vote just to get the money, which it means they will care very little about what their vote is. If somebody did not care enough to vote in the first place, and then started to care when they got the 3 Big Macs or the $100, they will go just to get it done. That's pretty sad because we'll get the wrong people in the government, and this government will not necessarily be reflecting the opinions of the people.
So you would rather
I completely don't understand how paying people to vote and without stipulating any voting preferences is going to corrupt the government itself. More people are going to be voting, so there is going to be a chance for better representation of more ideas.
I'll tell you how. This person is going to vote just to get the $100. And when they do that, they're going to vote for something that doesn't necessarily represent them.
It's just not representative because you just go in, it's like a chore, you just tick any box and then you're gone, you're done. There's no...
On that note, it might not be a function of how much someone cares about voting, but how informed they are about their ballot options.
deliberative.
Plus, we've had a similar system, the highest rate of voting in the entirety of the United States was political machine era, 1860 to 1920, where you got paid regardless of which machine that you voted for. When you read testimonials from machine leaders at the time, they say, you're getting rid of patriotism. You know, people want to vote, but they're wanting to vote because of private gains. And it results in a less than sincere engagement with the process. To respond to your point, Lindsay, more people in the process is a better thing for a democracy. But more people in the process who are not informed, who don't pay attention, and simply check a box to get it over with, might actually be a worse thing. I think that we need more sincerely engaged people in the process.
But by sincerely, Kevin, you said people will just be voting for private gain. That's the wrong motive for voting?
Yes,
the wrong reason?
and this is also why I disagree with the casino point. To allow for gambling is a collective decision made by a society which might bring benefits to that society. But if it becomes a collective decision for specifically private gains rather than tax revenue going towards a public project, that to me seems a strange transference, right? It changes from a collective problem to one of private gains.
So voting for the sake of one's own private gain, that's a misuse of the vote.
Voting entirely based upon that.
I think the time that it takes any one person to become truly informed about the decision that they're making far outweighs the tiny benefit that they get as a voter in an enormous democracy. So I don't think that rational ignorance is somehow perverse. I think it's completely understandable.
But Ellie, you've used this term rational ignorance. How could ignorance ever be rational?
The amount of time that it would take one individual to understand the policies of the different parties, given all of the enormous information costs, the fact that the media is quite often misleading, that truly outweighs the tiny, tiny benefit that one individual would gain.
You say that it isn't worth going to the trouble, if you think about it.
I say that we can't expect people to go to vote because of some kind of altruism. I think that people go to vote because it's an expression of their preferences and they feel better having done it, not because they expect some kind of overall gain.
Kevin said private gain should not be the primary motive for voting. And Nicole, a moment ago, you said it should be about deliberating. You agree with Kevin?
I agree with Kevin. I think that what Ellie said puts a little bit too low of an expectation on people. Reading the newspaper, knowing what's going on in the world, I don't think it's that much to ask. And I think that most people, they have their own ideas about what's best for themselves, and they also have their own ideas about what's in the best interest of society. And it doesn't take a lot to have a conversation with somebody and get involved in that process. Lots and lots of people do it, and I think that it's perhaps a little bit elitist to think that the general population doesn't feel the same way.
I'm not sure that Ellie is arguing that the general population is incapable of coming to fully informed decisions, but perhaps they don't really have an incentive to do so because the expected value of casting a vote and having that vote result in some sort of desirable outcome for the individual is very low.
There are some who suggest that voting is mainly and should be a matter of weighing the benefits and the costs. And then on the other hand, voting should not be thought of as a matter of weighing benefits and costs, but instead deliberating about the common good, not about seeking private gain, but about the public interest. What are the expressive benefits of voting?
I would say a selective benefit would feel that I contributed to my country's democratic process.
There's a really simple reason for that, because it doesn't reflect the intensity of preferences of a potential minority. If you have, for example, a very small percentage of people who have a lot of money or special interests, they could purchase votes, even though there's a minority who can't afford it, who has extremely strong preferences.
Emily?
I agree with Josh on this. I think in an ideal world, everybody goes out to vote the way that they think is best. You end up with the best representation of what society wants. Creating a free market for votes would not end up with that.
But if different people have different degrees of intensity to their convictions, I may care deeply about the outcome. Matthew may not care all that much. We each have one vote. So how does adding up those votes register the intensity that Matthew or I might have about the outcome? Jamie?
As soon as we create a market for purchasing and selling votes, it would be tainted strongly by ability to pay instead of just willingness to pay or intensity of preferences. So democracy does not encompass your intensity of your views, but that's better off than tainting it with ability to pay.
Kevin?
Okay, you cannot and should not be able to sell an inalienable right. If you have a more intense opinion, how do you make that opinion mean something more? You engage in democratic deliberation and convince them to come to your side. Democracy does capture intensity preferences, and it does it through collective action. And this is why simply looking at voting in the conception of democracy is a completely limited way of understanding the entire nature of democratic society.
All right, what about that challenge? For those who've taken the view that voting is not a civic duty, but a way of pursuing one's own interests, that the rational thing to do is to weigh costs and benefits. If you hold that view, then why shouldn't each person, to give expression to his or her individual preferences, be free either to cast the vote or to sell the vote? Matthew.
Can't selling your vote be sort of coercive? So, for example, if I'm someone who is in the lower 10% income bracket, if someone offers me $10,000 for my vote to decrease the tax bracket on the highest 1%, obviously I'm going to take the $10,000 even though I'm voting against my own preferences, regardless of how intense I feel about that. And so you have this bias that's unrepresentative of the democracy.
So we should legally block your right to make that choice.
I believe you shouldn't allow a market for votes.